We will always look to try and make sure the full diversity of Canada and Indigenous representation is part of our considerations.
Tonight, who will replace the retiring RCMP commissioner?
We have an incredible strategy.
Leaders in BC search out justice for all. And the NHL's Winnipeg Jets celebrate Indigenous culture in the heart of the largest urban Indigenous centre in Canada. Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward. Welcome to APTN National News. We begin in northern Manitoba, where the Opioid Cree Nation has declared a state of emergency. Chief Shirley Ducharme made the announcement today following a string of critical incidents in the community that is also known as South Indian Lake. The First Nation is just over 1,000 kilometers north of Winnipeg, Manitoba. Chief Ducharme said the community needs immediate help from all levels of government to address addictions and mental health issues. Noreen Tate died in a Winnipeg hospital after an assault on February 19th. And on March 1st, another woman was found unresponsive after a snowmobile got stuck. She later died at the community's nursing station. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau made a quick stop in Winnipeg last week, where he made a childcare announcement, but was then grilled by media about other issues. When APTN asked about naming an Indigenous person as the next RCMP commissioner to replace retiring Brenda Lucki, he said it was an excellent idea, but the decision will be made through an independent process.
We will always look to try and make sure the full diversity of Canada and Indigenous representation is part of our considerations. But we have to understand that it's not just about putting the right person at the top of an organization that makes the systemic change necessary. There is a huge amount of work on structures within our institutions, including the RCMP, to ensure that the entire force, the entire system is fully respectful of Indigenous people, respectful of diversity, inclusive in everything it does.
We'd like to hear what you have to say about the next RCMP commissioner. Here's how to continue the conversation. You can send us an email to news@aptn.ca or comment on this story on our website. That's aptnnews.ca. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. With the opioid epidemic continuing to sweep across the country, the province of British Columbia made a major step forward in addressing the issue. The province recently announced its budget for 2023. $6.4 billion was allocated to health. $1 billion of that has been solely directed to dealing with mental health and addiction services.
There are a number of projects that are underway facing rising costs that have not been moving fast enough for the urgent needs in your community. So through Budget 2023, I'm happy to announce $35 million to support the completion and to speed up construction of 8 First Nations treatment centres across the province. I know for all of us, this is too urgent a situation for any further delays, and the province is stepping up to make sure the work can get done urgently. I recognize the disproportionate impact that the toxic drug crisis has had on Indigenous people in our province, on Indigenous communities. Every life lost to toxic drugs is one too many.
Well, while the Prime Minister continues his plans to sign bilateral health funding agreements with every province and territory in Canada, he also was recently in BC to announce a new multi-billion-dollar fund to ensure Indigenous people will also have better health care. APTN's Tina House has that story.
Here at the annual gathering of Wisdom Forum in Vancouver, hundreds of people came from across the country to talk about health care, including Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who announced the new Indigenous Health Equity Fund.
This fund will support First Nation, Inuit and Métis partners who can respond to the unique and systemic challenges they face every day when accessing health services.
The $2 billion deal over the next 10 years aims to help clear backlogs, making it easier to receive faster health care and be driven by Indigenous-led regional and community health care needs. As each province and territory enters into bilateral health agreements with the federal government, the Prime Minister says Indigenous people will have a say.
Provinces and territories have a responsibility to ensure that Indigenous peoples have equal access to care when they need it, free of racism and discrimination. These bilateral agreements must respect these rights and principles. Before any deal gets finalized, we'll work with Indigenous leadership to include you in these important discussions. And we'll work together to make sure that there are measurable results.
And during the forum, 84% of the over 170 First Nations ratified the Indigenous Health Equity Fund.
The words that you said in 2015, Prime Minister, is that we reminded us about bringing across real change for First Nations in British Columbia and across Canada. I want to thank you for taking time for being here, the first time ever. Your presence signals a future marked by true nation-to-nation relationships with First Nations in BC, one that is based on the understanding that the constitutionally guaranteed rights of First Nations are a sacred obligation that each of us must carry forward.
And for Patty Hadju, Minister of Indigenous Services, she says this new fund will make a difference.
I know that we are charting a course together that will mean that the young mother with her children can see a brighter future, that the elder person has their needs met in their community and with family, that the person recovering from trauma has culturally appropriate tools that will help them heal. These are big things we're doing together, healing ancient wounds.
Tina House, APTN National News,
to the
Vancouver.
First Nations Health Council and the First Nations.
Well, today, Indigenous Services Minister Patty Hadju, who you just saw there, was before the Standing Committee on Indigenous Affairs. She said Indigenous high school and university graduation rates are lagging behind non-Indigenous levels, even though the federal government has increased on-reserve funding for First Nations students by 74% since 2015. She also said better on-reserve school buildings could help improve things.
But the deficit left by 10 years of sparse to no new money spent on Indigenous youth also meant that infrastructure is often decrepit or unsafe. Indigenous youth deserve and need safe places to learn.
Time for a quick break. Coming up, a 3-day forum on Indigenous justice starts in BC.
We have an incredible strategy.
Welcome back. BC First Nation Justice Council is hosting their second annual forum in Vancouver this week. Hundreds of First Nations leaders are gathering to learn about how Indigenous justice is progressing in BC. BC First Nation Justice Council welcomed attendees to the forum this morning. The 3-day forum will include community safety and policing, First Nation women's justice, and a national Indigenous justice strategy. In 2020, First Nations and the BC government signed the BC First Nation Justice Strategy to address poor justice outcomes for BC First Nations. Leaders hope the forum will lead to change in the province.
We have an incredible strategy, and if you notice, there's 25 initiatives and lines of action under each of them. So this is where we really want your support and your knowledge and your expertise to help us really make this plan and implement this plan and create an action and make some substantial systemic changes in British Columbia. So
A group of Indigenous law students has developed the first wrongful conviction registry in Canada. To no one's surprise, there aren't a lot of Indigenous people on the list. We spoke with University of Toronto law professor Kent Roach earlier. Professor Roach, great to have you with us. Your students built a registry that shows 83 people have been exonerated in Canada. Would you be able to give us an overview of just who these people are?
Sure. So these are people who have been convicted or pled guilty, and then new evidence has been discovered, and they've either been acquitted or they have the prosecutor has not proceeded against them. Of the 83, 14 are Indigenous men, 2 are Indigenous women. And we in no way think that this is all of the people who have been wrongfully convicted in Canada. We think this is tip of the iceberg.
So, Professor Roach, you and I know that there are far more Indigenous people in prison than any other race. So why isn't this reflected in the registry?
Well, I think it isn't reflected for the same reasons that over a third of the prison population is Indigenous. There is discrimination in the justice system, and that includes in the process of getting errors corrected or remedied. So the fact that there's 16 shows that there's a problem, but that is an underrepresentation compared to the over 1/3 of the prison population, and of course even higher numbers with Indigenous women and Indigenous youth.
Well, we've done stories here at APTN on some of the Indigenous people on your list. Well, why do you think they're not household names like David Milgaard, who was exonerated on new DNA evidence?
Yes, no, I mean, it's an important question. And in fact, we were very inspired by APTN reporting about both the Clayton Boucher case and the Connie Oakes case in Alberta. And Alberta is actually in second place with 12 wrongful convictions. And of course, this goes back to Wilson Neprus's case, which came right after Donald Marshall Jr.'s case. And Alberta has never had a public inquiry into a wrongful conviction, and most of its wrongful convictions have involved Indigenous people. And so there may, unfortunately, be a relationship between that. I think it's also that there's developed an expectation that there will be a clear-cut kind of DNA exoneration. But the problem is that DNA only applies in a minority of cases, and if you assume a halfway competent justice system, and I agree that sometimes can be a stretch, DNA should be used to exclude people. And I come back to the Wilson Neprus case because, you know, the victim in that case was one of the many missing and murdered Indigenous women, Beverly Desjardins. And so it shows that at least in those whodunit cases where the police and the prosecutors and the justice system gets it wrong, it's also Indigenous people that often pay the price, because Indigenous people, as you know, are disproportionately subject to victimization by crime.
Right. So, Professor, now that you've built the registry, what are you hoping happens next?
Well, there's a couple. As Amanda Carling, a Métis woman who's a co-teacher of me, has said, we wanted to tell the stories as best we could from public documents about these 83 people. All of these people matter. And so now you can go onto the website. It's at www.wrongfulconvictions.ca, and you can read on the stories of these people based upon publicly available documents. So it's a bit of honoring these people. The second purpose is we hope that this raises awareness among law students, justice students, and justice system participants, because it's been a long time since we've had a public inquiry into a wrongful conviction. And if people are not reminded about this. Out of sight, out of mind. And so we hope that this reveals new causes and new patterns. One of the striking findings we find is that 18% of the cases, of the 83 cases, were guilty pleas, including Clayton Boucher. So this says really every case in the justice system, not just the contested trials, which are the minority, but the guilty pleas, is a potential miscarriage of justice. And the second finding that we think is really significant is a third of the cases, the third of the 83 cases, are cases where no crimes were ever committed. And of course, you think about the Charles Smith case where he thought dirty often about Indigenous caregivers. And Tammy Marquardt and Bill Mullins-Johnson, both Anishinaabe people, were wrongfully convicted of murders that never happened. Of children that unfortunately died from natural causes. And we tell the story of another Indigenous man from New Brunswick, James Turpin, which I think is an important reminder that some of the problems that we saw in Ontario in the Charles Smith cases didn't just necessarily go away with Charles Smith, they persist. And the problem with imagined crimes is too often stereotypes and suspicions about Indigenous people are translated into convictions and guilty pleas, even though the justice system is supposed to give all accused the benefit of a reasonable doubt.
Well, Professor Roach, important work indeed. Appreciate you speaking with us about it.
Thank you, Dennis.
Welcome back. Time now for our photo of the day. And this beauty of a shot of the almost full moon comes to us from Aldina Lequette. Aldina took this shot at 9:26 p.m. Saturday night from her home in Bissett, Manitoba. Thanks for this, Aldina. And the full moon happens tomorrow night, according to Bruce Spence. Keep those pictures coming. You can send them to share@aptn.ca. Now here's tomorrow's weather forecast. Starting on the East Coast, +2 with snow for Halifax, Fredericton, and St. John's. +2 in Kuujjuaq, -1 in Nain. 2 below with snow in Montreal, -6 with flurries in Val-d'Or. Sunny and +2 in Sault Ste. Marie, -1 in North Bay. +1 in cloudy in Thunder Bay, -7 for Sioux Lookout. -14 and sunny skies for God's Lake and Norway House. 12 below in Winnipeg, cloudy and -13 in Brandon. -13 with snow in Regina, 11 below and flurries in North Battleford. -9 with snow in Meadow Lake and Buffalo Narrows. In northern Alberta, -11 with snow in Fort Chip, 8 below and flurries in Fort McMurray. -5 with snow in Edmonton, snow and 3 below in Lethbridge. +9 in Vancouver, 7 above for Victoria. -2 with snow in Prince George, 5 below and snow in Smithers. 17 below in Old Crow, -12 in Whitehorse. -17 in Yellowknife, 21 below with snow in Norman Wells. -25 in Sax Harbor, 24 below for Paulatuck. -27 in Cambridge Bay, 20 below in Whale Cove. -18 in Resolute, +5 in Pangertung. Pangertung, Nunavut, 20 degrees warmer tomorrow than Winnipeg. Well, in other Nunavut news, the annual Tim Hortons Brier kicked off this weekend in London, Ontario, with 18 curling teams competing for their chance to represent Canada at the Worlds next month in Ottawa, including Team Nunavut, who hadn't won a game until now. Members of the crowd gave a long standing ovation after the last rock was thrown and their first victory was secured. Team Nunavut hails from the Iqaluit Curling Club. Skip Jake Higgs and the team defeated Newfoundland and Labrador on Saturday by a score of 7-4. Nunavut currently stands at 1 win and 3 losses. They will take on Team Saskatchewan at 6 p.m. Central tonight. That is all the time we have for your APTN National News for this Monday. For news anytime, you can visit our website, aptnnews.ca, and never miss a story by downloading our APTN News app. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks for being with us. Have a great night.